Good morning, and many thanks for the invitation to present. Um, the topic, basically, that I'm going to focus is quite a different one. Um, the, I mean, in a workshop that was organized by the Roet and Scottish government last year, if I remember well, sort of end of November. There was some interesting information in terms of facts that processed products were the major contributors to solve fats and sugar. This was a very interesting presentation by the Food Standard Agency in Scotland. And because of that, I decided not to go on the demand side, but go on the supply side and deal with this topic. So the purpose of the presentation is basically discuss to what extent large businesses, and include supermarkets, influence what food is produced, how it is produced, and this is based on the work that we do for the Scottish government, but there's no, all of this is basically my opinions, so nothing to do with the Scottish government in that sense. Um, I think it's important if you want to see the origin, the supply of food, not just to pick the supermarkets, you're going to see why, but also consider manufacturing. What Mike was calling the transnational corporations, because they are plenty of very important for that. And this is a huge topic. If you've seen the supply, this is a massive. If you want to deal with supply chains, you see that this is an amazing topic in size. So I pick potatoes because it's a very popular thing to sort of give examples. And this is the distribution of value of the actually the retail potato market in Scotland. And the fresh potatoes actually only make 38% of the total value, which most of them being processed. 38.2% for crisps, which is a quite a significant thing, and frozen potato products 23%, which add up to the 61.6. And I'm almost sure that when I did the calculations, some processed potato products were not included. So it might be even more important. Just to frame this, here you have a comparison in terms of how important are supermarkets. In terms of groceries, you have in 2010 the top four represented 79% of the groceries. There's in 2013 you have a slight reduction to 76% of the top four, but you have other quite important things. So that gives you how amazing is the size of these entities. And I should mention that I choose plenty of Cantar World Panel data. Um, and basically the slight decrease in the percentage of the top four was because of Lidl and Aldi, and so which were the new. But this would give you sort of a partial view of the supply when you think in terms of supermarkets. And here you have the three categories: the fresh potatoes, let's call it fresh, the crisps and the frozen potatoes. In the case of potatoes, and this happens basically with many of produce, the own category, the private label, the supermarket label, is the most important part. Supermarkets are the ones who basically manage that part. However, on crisps and frozen potatoes, you can see manufactured products are the ones that are the important part, the domination. Think in terms of crisps, for instance, PepsiCo. I mean, many of you probably eat Walkers. Frozen potatoes. I mean, several of you buy, for instance, the oven chips from McCain or so. There you have. I mean, you have what part is supermarkets, what part is with companies. Um, Dawson in 2013, and that's a very interesting paper about explaining supermarkets, often claims that retailers tend to say that basically what they respond is to what consumers want, and that's what they provide. Well, to some extent, it's true, but I mean, there are things. The part that is, I say that is true is retailers depend on consumers visiting their store. I mean, if they don't go, I mean, they don't sell. And consumers, through their food buying activity, shape many of the dimensions. I mean, that's the support part. But at the end of the day, the decisions of what's available in the supermarket is made by the retailer. I mean, and this is something that I smuggled from Max Spencer. It's a piece of wrapping paper, probably you cannot read it. And basically, what is, for me, it reflects more or less this idea. Whatever you're in the mood for, I mean, is you, whether it's something simple or real treat, we have. I mean, it's not that you can come and we are going to give you what you want. No, it's we have delicious things for you every day of the week. I mean, I'm not picking on Marks Spencer, I mean, in particular, but it was so nice to find the phrase in the wrapping paper. And actually, the entire shop is with plenty of these sustainability messages that makes it very interesting for examples. Um, so, going to the influence of what food is produced. I mean, the strategic objective of retailers is to increase sales. I mean, this is in the paper by Dawson. But if you go to the, where it should be my institution logo, you can see that circle, which actually belongs to ASDA. And that tells you basically their motto. And this is in the relationship with their suppliers, which says operate for less, buy for less, sell for less, and grow sales. So it's not my invention. So sales growth is a very important part of the retailers. And the other part is this has to be driven by innovation and the competition between retailers and manufacturers actually just depends on how innovative they are. If you see, I mean, this is very interesting because you see the innovation all over and how innovative products are important to fight, say, health problems, important for sustainability, for a number of things. So it's open your eyes, see the calls, for instance, for research, and you'll see this expressed. I mean, the choice of what is offered, the assortment, how it is presented on the shelves, what products are offered, what are private labels, are all on a strategy. So, in order more or less in a sort of organized way to present this, if you see the supermarket influences, you can go through, I mean, what is offered. You have first produce, which is, as I said, mostly supermarket private labels, although you have different things. I mean, probably if you buy the roasted potatoes, you have a branded produce by Albert Bartels. And then you have manufactured products, which are the private labels, which is the supermarkets and the branded products. In terms of produce and also the one thing by Fernand Hughes is fresh produce is a destination category. It can attract people to the supermarket, and but then you have all these sort of category tactics within the supermarket that shape what is put I mean, how affordable are things, how you merchandise the stuff, and you have these sort of four, probably they are the four keys. You have the assortment in terms of the brand versus limited, which is something of the things, for instance, that Mike was mentioning. I mean, what is offering a supermarket? Do you have a very broad assortment of fruits, for instance, or very limited one? Merchandising, I mean, where do you put it in a store? I mean, the location of the shelf space. Promotion, which is a very important one within retailing. And of course, everybody of you have heard about the word prices. So price is an important. Just to bring some examples of work that we've been doing recently, is for instance is the proportion of the expenditure sold under promotion. And you can see for all these categories actually quite an increasing trend, probably from 2006. I couldn't do it before because I don't have data, until 2011. So all this is the period, if you want, of recession and the increasing competition in the use of promotions to sell. But also look at what are the top three. I mean, basically you have there soft drinks and juices, you have beverages, and you have sweet confectionery. So all your things in terms of sugar consumption are there. And this is a more complicated table, which I'm not going to go through. But if you break this, the importance of promotions by quintile, you're going to see that all the quintiles are affected by promotions on the different categories, and that affects the total expenditure. In terms of moving out of produce and going to manufacture products, what you have is the choice within a category and the way that you manage the category is exactly the same. But the part that I'm mostly interested on this, and I'm going to devote a little bit more, is on new product development, because of it tells you things about competition on retailing, competition on manufacturing. According to this lady, Ruth Rubishek, it's a paper of 1988 that I found. It's a quite interesting one, very mathematical, but very nice. Is a paper that talks about product proliferation, which is something that you see every day. Probably you don't realize because we are totally accustomed to that, but is the way that supermarkets and manufacturers actually compete on the market. And she calls this way of competition hitting the jackpot, because basically it's finding a product that appeals to consumer, brings plenty of money, and stays on the shelf for a long time. I mean, this is the kind of competition, for instance, that you see when you go to a supermarket and look for cereals, and many of this literature actually was brought by the zoo of Kellogg's with the cereals and all the market power. But here you have, for instance, the case of Chips and McCain introducing all these new products, and you have the years. So you have the oven chips, the microchips, the rustic oven chips, the jackets, and all that. And this is part of the thing. Far more interesting is if you see crisps. I mean, this is just a small selection that I pick on crisps. Yesterday I was playing with the GMPD, the database, which is about new product development. It's a database from Intel. And I asked how many new products were introduced by Walkers since 2010. And I got, surprisingly, for only for potato crisp, 193. I mean, not all of them remain in the market, but it's interesting how they compete. And you can see on the left Walkers and all the flavors. And then you have Tesco on the other side and the flavor trying to compete with that. So it's in both of them. And but the other interesting thing, particularly when you start figuring out the impact that new products, I mean, with healthy characteristics and that kind of things, can have into the market, is when you start seeing the statistics in terms of the percentage that actually reach consumers or remain into the market. I mean, one figure that I got from Professor Hughes was according to Nielsen UK, the percentage of new products that fail is 90%. So actually, the impact of new products on health, I mean, should be quite small. I mean, I mean, all these supply chains, particularly since the 90s, have evolved, and you have that. What happened on the supply chains is that the manufacturers and retailers have become more integrated with actually with the beginning of the chain, which actually is the farmer, and in some cases even more. I mean, some of these have come through the need of competition, through the need of competition, food safety legislation, rationalization of the supply base. I mean, instead of many small producers to big, and to increase the amount of innovation. This is one of the supply chains, for instance, that tells you the kind of coordination. This is a local, in the case of Mackey's Crisp. And you have the how engineer is the connection from the farm to the almost to the fork. Um, Far more sophisticated is, for instance, the case of McCain, where you have these connections not just from farm to fork, but also on the financial part, land ownership, and is quite an impressive way of organize the supply chain in order to ensure reliable supply of potatoes. Um, so in terms of if you move to a retailer supply chain, what you're going to have is something very similar, but it's the processor, the one that it's going to be sort of checking the traceability of the product, and and the retailer has a role there of monitoring the standards. I mean, they are basically auditing the process, but the one who does the sort of dirty work is the processor that is part of of that chain. So just to make the story short, some final remark. Overall, you have that retailers and manufacturers have an important role as regards what is produced and how it is produced. I mean, you have strategies in terms of category management, what you do on these ones, and how they compete with other products. I mean, it is sort of hitting the jackpot competition. Uh, they influence how products are produced and what is produced, how to organize their supply chains. And there are implications on all these, on production practices, on environment, on health and food choice, on culture and global demand for food. For instance, in terms of implications, as you can imagine, you have production practices that in large measure are determined and enforced by the captain of the supply chain. That can be the retailer or can be the manufacturer. All your environmental impacts depend on those practices, and also have in mind that sustainable practices can be a marketable attribute and can be enforced by the supermarket or manufacturer. Of course, The second one is sort of obvious. I mean, the issue of fairness on the supply chain. I mean, this kind of integrated supply chain where there's a captain of the chain implies that there's or there might be an issue of an equal power balance and therefore the distribution of created value. In terms of health, I mean, what you're going to have is if you expect due to social corporate responsibility that the assortment of products that you're going to see in the retail is going to improve because new healthy products are coming, you're going to see that, I mean, these healthy products are going to come if they bring money, but there won't be a recall of unhealthy products if they continue bringing money. I mean, probably the most obvious example that we've seen lately is the Coca-Cola Life. I mean, you have Coca-Cola Life entering into the market, but you didn't have reformulation of Coca-Cola, the regular Coca-Cola, or Coca-Cola removing the Coca-Cola. And this is quite an obvious thing in marketing. Product reformulation is something that has worked. I mean, the experience of the Food Standard Agency on salt, but there are limitations in terms of science, what can be done or what cannot be done. And also, important, the impact that it might have on the demand. Change the product, it will change the flavor, it will change the demand, and that has economic implications. So you will have, for instance, if you talk about a soda tax or that kind of things, change the sugar and you might lose some customers, and that's why you have lobbies fighting for against these kind of measures. Culture, it's obvious. If you put a limited number of soft fruit to bring Mike's example, I mean, that's what the consumer knows. I mean, very few consumers, I mean, consumers are quite a heterogeneous bunch. Don't try to think that they are one type and knowledgeable about fruits. They see, I mean, they know what they see in a supermarket, and they are going to go and see that strawberries might be sold all over the year, I mean, all along the year, and and from one variety, which is not necessarily a Scottish variety. So all these kind of things affect the culture. So many thanks for